The man who has renounced war has renounced the grand life. This is the Yoakum Strength Podcast with me, your host, Austin Yoakum. And on this episode of the podcast, we have Justin Kuehn. Justin was first back on the podcast in 2020, maybe 2019, when he was a strength coach at NDSU for the wrestling team. And from the last podcast to this one, Justin has been on a whirlwind of a career path that has led him from being one of the first Army strength coaches hired in the new H2F program. And today we talk about just that program, the importance of upgrading sports performance in the tactical settings, and why Justin is actually leaving his position to pursue a new career. This is a podcast full of really, really awesome training advice, a lot of which I knew nothing about on the tactical side of things. Some of their injury rates and the overuse injury specifically, and even their wartime injury, like statistics that he gives during this podcast really, really blows your mind and really just shows you how when you're stuck in a certain way of thinking, even though you have all the data points pointing to something else that could be better, it's really hard to break out of your current biases. And he covers that really well. But even more so than the training advice, I just really love his career and life advice. It's really nice to hear from somebody who's unwilling to compromise to the system, especially because he believes he can better the system. He can help the system. It's not just rebelling to rebel, but because he believes he can better the system and hopefully help more people and be more of use, and just not listening to just random people telling you things and standing up for your beliefs and saying what you feel like you should say, regardless of the consequences. And that's been really, really refreshing to hear from a lot of guests that we've had on this podcast, but specifically Justin's story. And it was very similar to my story at St. Thomas. And it was really nice to have a conversation with somebody that's also been through it, not just talking about mental toughness, not just talking about their philosophies, but actually living it. And when it comes down to it, are you drawing the line? You talk about drawing the line, but are you drawing the line when it gets to the point? And I think Justin lives and breathes some of the philosophies that many of us talk about and don't actually do when it comes down to it. A couple of dates on my life in the podcast itself. We went viral on Instagram. Unbelievably so stupid. I posted a Instagram reel purposely because I didn't have enough time that day to make anything that I wanted to make. And I was just making a joke about how plyometrics are better than bench press. Like the actual thought behind it was that athletes don't do plyometrics for their upper body. So if they do them and then they start using them, the low hanging fruit there is going to give them so much more than the bench press because they've done the bench press since they've been like 10 years old. And just put in the hook that this is better than bench press. It went for 2 million views. Not a single person read the caption. Some of those comments in those, like, it just makes you lose faith in a little bit of humanity and makes you lose faith in our field. But it's humorous. So if you guys are looking for some entertainment, it's why this is better than bench press. I think I posted it like a week ago now. It got 2 million views, and the comments are unbelievable. And again, will make you lose a little bit of faith in your counter humans, but it's humorous. It's humorous of the level of experts out there that just throwing facts out there. So that's been something that's happening. I just finished How to Change Your Mind, the book right here for people watching the video here, by Michael Pollan. I know I'm kind of into the psychedelic world, probably a little bit too much to go back and read that, or it seems like I probably should have read that first. But for anybody that's questionable on psychedelics, or like on the outside, a little bit skittish, a little bit scared, I think this book did a really nice job of covering somebody's story of who hadn't tried psychedelics to trying psychedelics. Something that I'm thinking about giving my parents, and just other people that are on the edge or just a little bit more cautious with these things, as you probably should be. Like, I'm not saying being like me where I just fucking full-fledged into things is a good thing. So if you're cautious and a smart person, it's a really nice book covering all the science behind it and his personal journey of how he went through that journey, why he went through that journey, some of the sketch like kind of BS that's surrounding it, all the mystic like kind of BS that is there, and then some of the really good stuff. And then I really enjoyed that. Podcast wise, we got Joel Smith coming on next week. And then a couple other bangers that are coming up. Haven't finalized dates in them, but some really cool people. And I'm just excited to continue to do this, excited to continue to talk to people, and guests that I really, really enjoy having conversations with, and hopefully making it a little bit more interactive with listeners. I really enjoy your guys' feedback. I really enjoy knowing that people are getting something out of this podcast. So if you guys ever have any suggestions, ever have any guests you think I should have on, ever have anything that you guys enjoy and you just heard and like really like that, I would love to hear. And I would love to make this podcast a really good space for people to speak their minds and just have open, honest conversations about things and taking it as many different directions as possible. So that was super long-winded intro, but just appreciate you guys. I appreciate that people are willing to listen to this stuff, and thank you. Before we hit the intro music, I wanted to introduce to you guys the Yoakum Strength Insider. The Yoakum Strength Insider is our online training platform that takes all of the ideas that we talk about on this podcast and implements them into a program that is available to you at the touch of your fingers. Our goal with the Yoakum Strength Insider is to create better movers, to level up your life, and to move forward from where you are. We do this in a holistic fashion. Not only will you receive a program that has helped hundreds of people become better movers, you'll also receive access to our app that allows you to track everything, has video links for all exercises, and allows you to be in constant communication with a Yoakum Strength coach. Along with this, you'll get our 30-page PDF nutrition and lifestyle guidelines. That includes everything from what to eat, how much of it to eat, why we're eating it, meditation habits, and other lifestyle habits that we implement with our clients to really level up their lives. If you're interested in trying out one of these programs, use podcast 25 in the discount section right before you pay for 25% off your first program. Boom.
This is the Yoakum Strength Podcast. Take the leap down the rabbit hole with us as we interview elite level guests to unravel what high performance really is.
Well, Justin, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have you back.
It's good to be back, not masked up and in COVID times anymore.
Yeah. Well, way back in the day, man, our very first phone call was like, what was that? Like 2018?
Oh yeah, that would have been 2018, 2019 when I was at NDSU and you were at St. Olaf.
The Olaf interview. I was looking through my notebook, and I looked at the notes, and I just remember I was gonna post them the other day, and I totally fucking forgot about it. And then I realized we had this podcast. I'm like, I'll post them when we have the podcast. But it was just like notes on the like all the people, and it was like everybody else is trash, and like Justin, like this guy's a keeper, like bring him here. And then we had him on the podcast. Like, what year did we have you on the podcast? Like 2020, maybe.
Yeah, it was when COVID hit. 'Cause I did it at my sister's apartment back in Naperville.
That's right. Yeah. So like it's kind of like a 2-year gap every time. But yeah. Sounds like you've had an exciting and not super fun past week or month or so.
Yeah, I had the fortune or misfortune, depending how this plays out, of getting fired and on pretty short notice from my job after a little over 2 years with it. And have been, figuring out things since then and processing it and, kind of getting all the details together. But it really, like, I was already job searching as is, but it was kind of a rough way to go out and a inconvenience, to put it mildly. But I mean, yeah, it was still, getting to work with the military for 2 years was still an awesome experience. And I think as ingrained as I was to collegiate strength conditioning, just getting exposure to a new environment with new challenges, still one of the most rewarding experiences ever. And obviously getting to meet such a diverse group of people and see everything grow over 2 years was an awesome experience, but it was certainly not how I anticipated going out.
Yeah, well, I saw your post on Instagram and I thought like so many things, but I was just like, bro, this sounds exactly like when I got fired from St. Thomas. When I got left, I was like, this is bullshit. Like the whole point of the tactical thing is like you're supposed to have more ownership, like you're supposed to be like more in control and just not have these like dumbass administrative guys like power tripping over it and like the unearned leadership that is there. Yeah, I actually trained a couple guys that are in the Army, and the unearned leadership they talk about and like the incompetence at the leadership level they talk about is brutal. And then I saw your post. I'm like, I would love to hear kind of how that happens. Like how does it get to a point in which like things like this happen? I guess like that's what I'm super interested in too. Like kind of at the gist of it, like how do you get to a point in which you have somebody that they're just talking with you and like understanding you, understanding your brother, understanding the people that you surround yourself with that would not surround themselves with you if you weren't a hard worker, if you weren't smart, if you weren't doing like you have all these boxes of like being a good employee, being a good coach, fucking exploring things past the like basic like box of what I feel like a lot of coaches are. You have this good employee, and as soon as it seems like these I don't even want to say corrupt, but these organizations that are not set up strongly get a strong employee or get somebody that just can say no in a meeting or just say anything in a meeting, like they almost always try to get rid of them. And then they wonder why like that leadership roles get filled by people that aren't leaders. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that whole thought process and kind of what happened when you were leaving.
I mean, so specific to the tactical setting and within like holistic health and fitness, the H2F program the Army's adopting, I think like the central issue that within the civilian side that 90% of the issues probably come back to is that the contracting companies doing the hiring just have no clue what they're hiring for. Like they have their boxes to check on paper, but they have no ability to actually objectively evaluate, are these qualified coaches? Does their experience matter? Because one of the biggest things that was a hurdle for me, even your experience as an intern or as a grad assistant in the collegiate setting can only count for a cumulative of 1 year. So even if you work a 2-year GA position, which I did, that's only considered 1 year of experience. But if you were personal training for that same amount of time, that counts as 2 years. And so like even something as small as that really opens you up to just how large the disconnect is between, and it's not to knock on personal trainers, but it's just a straight up fact. The environment you're operating within the military is, the closest comparable environment I would say is either like a Division III school or even the high school setting where you have an extremely large amount of people. Your athletic abilities are going to range from elite to have you ever even done anything physical in your life. And then I think one of the most unique things of the tactical setting is you get all those guys in a 90-minute window with next to no equipment. And so when you talk about applicability and your ability to be flexible and adaptable to just a very chaotic environment, that can only be developed through certain prerequisite jobs. And so that's something where like, yeah, if we're talking about relevant experience, me being a graduate assistant where I was, in the weight room for 60 plus hours a week, the fact that that only counts for 1 year is one, disrespectful, and two, symptomatic of a larger issue. But in terms of where things ended up with me and how my position played out, I mean, even now I'm still trying to kind of piece it all together because it was so sudden and abrupt. And the messaging I was getting from my lead and from my supervisor up until the point where I was fired was a very different tone than the one with which I was fired with. I've been at this unit took the job June of 2021. So I've been here for a little over 2 years. Was the longest tenured member on staff after our old lead had left. Him and I took the job at the same time. And then he went on to go work with First Group. But up until that point, like I was one of the people that a lot of my products and ideas and things that I've shared online and also things that have been done in-house, were distributed to other staff members. They were used as kind of templates, as models, and really used as someone that kind of could show people the ropes and get them up to speed. And for the first 1 year, 8 months in the job, zero complaints with me. I was constantly being told how good the work I was doing. We had some of the highest utilization with our unit, had tangible results to actually present to show that we had an impact, doing all the things that we were hired to do. And this new lead stepped into his position several months ago, and we had a good relationship up to that point, or so I thought. And I was someone who he routinely told how good of a job I was doing and that the standard of work I was doing was, much higher than some of our other coaches, and he would like to bring it up to that level. But when you're hiring people based on those very abstract criteria, at the time it was 3 years of experience, and then pretty much, do you have a pulse? I think was about as deep as it went, and your CSCS. You're going to get coaches who are objectively less qualified. And that's kind of one of those things that in this industry, they don't like. It's a very touchy subject. Like you have coaches who are very outspoken and critical. You look at Kier and all of his online shit, and people, they come at him left and right for calling out other coaches. But it's like, just because there's nuance in our industry does not mean it lacks objectivity. And so when you have coaches who are doing a less than stellar job, and we're not allowed to speak out about that when it reflects our performance as a whole, I think that's a recipe for just an unhealthy working environment. And then more importantly, if we're not allowed to speak out about it, but then you're going to bring down those higher performers to that level, I then think that's even more problematic because now it's taking away from work I could be doing, that's more constructive or more relevant to my job. And yeah, I mean, for the last few months, my boss knew that I was job searching, had been exploring other fields outside of strength conditioning. I'm sure we'll get into that later, but he had been very supportive of it. I was looking at jobs up in Seattle. He was helping me find, apartments, areas to live, all these different things, was going to be a reference. Again, nothing to suggest that I was insubordinate or a bad employee. And then had been going through an interview process with a company called Stryker Medical, and had been going for about 9 weeks at the time, and had been lucky enough to make it through to the final interview, which, if you've never done a medical sales interview or ever heard of it, it is the most extensive process I've ever been through for an entry level spot. Like 0 to 2 years of experience, I had 6 interviews over like a 10 to 11 week span. Like it was, and I mean, it was awesome because you get connected with the team, you get a very good idea of what everyone's about, and their ability, especially from the different managers you speak with, to articulate their leadership style, their development style, what goes into their team dynamic, their culture, and how they take responsibility for you. I think when I've only ever applied for strength conditioning jobs, you don't often get to see that side of it, but coming into that field and looking how they did it, it's at such a high level, and it really blew me away. But when I did finally make my way to getting to the final interview, it was at that point that I chose to give my commander notice that, hey, I'm in the final stage for an interview. It was something he had brought up when he first took command. He's like, I understand you guys need to move on to different positions. All I ask is that you give me as much heads up as possible, because, again, we're helping coordinate their physical training for 800 guys. If we just up and leave on a week or two's notice, like they plan everything 6, 8, 10 weeks out. So it's giving them that forewarning. And then also just the common courtesy of, I don't want to screw you guys over. I have a very good relationship with him. And so I made the decision to sit down, have a conversation with him, just to keep him in the loop. And so at that point, it was him, our command sergeant major, who's our second in command, a select few members of our staff that I had good relationships with, and then a small handful of soldiers who, like, again, I just knew very well. And it was one of those parts where, I understand that, objectively, maybe it isn't the most appropriate, but it certainly wasn't something where I was advertising this or, just shouting it from the hills. But these were people that I considered close friends. And so happened to bring that up to them. And then a week and a half, 2 weeks later, we were out at training on a Monday morning, and commander was working out. Everyone's outside. My boss happened to be about 10, 15 feet away as I was walking by. Commander just quickly, leaned over. He's like, hey, how are things going with the job search? Have you heard back with Stryker? Just checking in, because he's a great guy. And we had a quick minute 30 conversation about it. There was, a couple of the soldiers that he was training with that day that were nearby, but weren't really paying attention and in tune to it. And that was the end of the conversation. And that was at 7:45. 5 hours later at 12:30, I get a call from my boss. I need to come over to his office. Brings me in. Our installation lead is there. They sit me down and feed me the lines of like, oh, you've done a lot of great work here, yada, yada, yada. But because I had that conversation and informed him, and it was some just, diplomatic BS line of, I could no longer be trusted to put forth a product in good faith to the customer, i.e. the Army. And because of that, they would have to move forward without me. And it was like one of those things where I was sitting in that chair, and I think the only thing I said was, are you serious, or are you kidding? Because it was just that disbelief of like that, of all the things we've seen people do here, like people leaving at 10:30 in the morning, dress code issues, all these different things. You're firing me because I had the common courtesy to give my commander notice that, hey, in the next 2 to 4 weeks, I may be out of here. And then and so when they fire you from a job like this, so you have your common access card that like gets you on base and everything. So they take that from you, and then the lead has to go with you and back to your office and escort you to your car and then watch you go off post. And so he had to watch me make like 5 trips to and from my car, packing up all my shit in the office in the middle of the day. And like there are soldiers that are we're in the battalion headquarters buildings. So there's soldiers outside my office, and like all they see is me shuffling stuff back and forth. Wasn't able to go have a conversation with my commander, anybody to give them notice. And even the other coaches I worked with who were about to start a presentation that we had been working on, and both of them were brand new. They were in the other room, and all they see is me like taking some stuff out, but they had no notice either. And then just like that, I'm out of there for good. And here we are.
And here we are, bro. That's so fucking insane. Like, what's the lead up to something like that? Because I remember at like St. Thomas, when you were talking about how I mean, one of the things you said, you're not able to call bad coaches out, but like how you basically had to dumb down a lot of your stuff for other coaches, or bring yourself down to a level for the other coaches, otherwise it caused issues. And that's where I really noticed, like, the big thing at St. Thomas is, like, you would suggest change, or you'd be the only one talking at a lot of these meetings, and like you would be doing your job of saying what you're supposed to say, and like suggesting what you're supposed to suggest, and speaking out when you're supposed to speak out, like a good employee should, to move like it. But like it causes just enough like ripples in the ocean that an administrator, like a weak leader, doesn't want to deal with. Like they don't want to deal with any change. They would rather, like, as much as they say they want what's best for the athlete or the customer, like that's not, they want an easy life. Like they want an easy leadership. And if somebody's like presenting something that can cause that change, it's like it's just easier for them to get them out of their hair. Even if you're not direct, like nothing that I was doing at St. Thomas was like massively like preaching from the mountains or saying anything. It was like, maybe we should do this, maybe we should, like, that's probably a dumb idea, like small things like that. So like, what was that process like when you talked about some of the coaches? Like, you felt like you had to maybe dumb it down. I know you didn't say dumb it down, but you had to bring yourself like down to some of what the other coaches, unqualified coaches, kind of were like. What was that kind of process like for you? Like, how'd you have to deal with that?
And it wasn't even so like it wasn't necessarily anything I had to do, but it was, and this is where I find it's always like tough to talk about these things, whether publicly on a podcast or just having one-on-one conversations. Is like, by and large, like, great people, love them as people, but I also feel at the end of the day we're working in a professional capacity, and so you can be a great human, but you also need to be great at your job.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's something where, again, in our industry, because of the amount of just nuance that exists, that there aren't these hard, clear cut. It's not like sales, right? Where you can see who's hitting their quotas, who's exceeding their quotas, who's got the best customer satisfaction. There are those clear objective metrics. For us, it's, how strong is somebody, or, and that's especially in the tactical setting. It's what are your ACFT, the Army Combat Fitness Test, what are your ACFT scores, and what are your injury rates? But then with something like H2F, because of how it was rolled out and launched, and we weren't really given autonomy. And so when you stepped in this environment, again, for like the first 6-7 months, I was doing zero programming for anybody, because there was nothing to hold the Army's feet to the fire that they have to utilize us. And for an organization, people talk about sport coaches and sports in general being stuck in their ways, and those have only been around for a handful of decades. Army's been around for 248 years. We're back-to-back World War champs. We tied in Vietnam, depending how you look at it and who you talk to. But that entire time, the Army has trained itself. The physical fitness is considered the responsibility of the NCO, the non-commissioned officer. That is their sole duty. And historically speaking, the Army's fitness was running, push-ups, sit-ups, and rucking. And that was all they did. But obviously, as the demands of combat have changed, our understanding of physical fitness has changed. They've tried to evolve that. But when you're trying to bring in these outside experts, and especially civilians, into the active duty Army, there is a friction point there, of it being something like, hey, you're not a part of us, you don't understand the lifestyle. And then it's the same thing we see everywhere else, where it's perceived as an attack on their identity, when really it should be seen as a collaborative thing of, hey, we're here to support you. Like, you've done a great job, or to the best of your ability, but this is a profession. This is what I do for a living. There's so much more going into what bakes into holistic health and fitness, that on top of all your other responsibilities as a soldier, it is unreasonable to expect you to also be an expert in this domain. But really, with how it kind of got to the point of friction within myself and my lead, and just the direction we were going, is we started doing these weekly educations. And it was, a staff member had to present on something for an hour, like 45 minutes to an hour, once a week. And we would just do a rotating staff, and we got 13, 14 coaches on staff. But the thing is, with like how our environment works, like, you don't get a method and then you can just immediately implement it, or get an idea and immediately implement it, because the time it takes to enact change and to get all the people to sign off, within your chain of command, the smallest decision is like a 2 to 3 to 4 week thing. And then trying to disperse that out to a unit of 600 to 800 soldiers, it just doesn't happen in that time frame. But what it got to the point of is we were doing these educations that just flat out were not educational. And it felt quite literally, I don't know how, because Wojda was your coach at Olaf, right?
What was that?
Was Wojda your strength coach at Olaf when
Yep.
you were interning there?
Yep.
So yeah, it started to feel more like an internship curriculum where you had these like weekly assignments, and it was very like fundamental elementary stuff. Which again, if you're an intern, sure, but if you're a full-time professional, one, professional development should just be a part of who you are. Like you should not need to be asked or forced to read, to stay up to date on research, to read new books, to listen to new speakers, to explore ideas in your own training. That should just be built into who you are as a professional. But then more importantly, if we're going to have educations, there should be actionable things to take away. And then there should be time to take it away and apply it, not just have this rotating door of, new ideas or new topics being discussed. And when many of them are just objectively not constructive in any way, but then you continue to do that. And it's that sunk cost fallacy of continuing to invest in an idea. It's like, what are we doing? And then when you start to raise those concerns, or just you participate at first, but then you stop participating because, like you said, when you offer a dissenting opinion or you're critical of something, immediately you're the bad guy. And it's like, so you didn't want me to ask questions, or you didn't want me to attack this thing if it wasn't in support of it. Like, how healthy of discourse is that? How healthy of education is that? The whole idea of science is to disprove science. And so if you put an idea up there and it can't hold up to conjecture, like, then it's not a good idea. And I run that same way with everything I put out on my social media. If someone DMs me and they have criticisms, they have, try to poke holes in it. If I can't address those things, if I can't stand up to that criticism, then it's probably a shit fucking idea. But if I've done my research, if I, have spent time in the trenches and I know it to be true, or at least the most accurate truth I have, then I should have no problem with those criticisms, and I should be able to, address them and counter argument them one by one without a problem. But I think the more time that went on and just kept seeing that we're going to continue to do these things that other staffs, other brigades weren't doing. And these were things that, again, in my 2 years until this new lead took over, were not part of what we were doing. And he kept saying it was what the contracting company wanted. But then I was talking to coaches, other units, and it wasn't what they were doing. So it became this thing of like, is it what the contract company wants, or is it what you want? I don't know. But ultimately, like, it's taking away from me doing my job and the development I was doing on my own. And I don't see how that's a healthy work environment.
Yeah. So like with some of these, was it like they were requiring you to read like books? Was it just like like what do you guys, any examples of like things that were brought up? They're like, that is just so stupid. Or were they like giving bad ideas and then saying you needed to program that way? Like what was kind of happening in these meetings?
It was just that we were like, oh, my neighbors my neighbors crashed into the podcast out. I got the window right here. It was just like, so one of the ones we did was a coach had put on, and the idea was to evolve our educations, because we kept doing these different iterations every 13 weeks. After all the coaches had gone, we do a different cycle with a different emphasis. And the latest cycle we were doing was one where we wanted to involve the green suiters, the soldiers, and the idea was collaborating with them on what they would like to see, and then putting on educations that were open to them. Now, granted, you were already supposed to be doing educations with your soldiers in-house, with your battalion. Each battalion is going to have anywhere from 1 to 2 coaches. Like, that was something you were already supposed to be facilitating based on the needs of your battalion and what would work with their schedule. Because it's as much time as these guys do have in their day, the soldiers, it's variable. And our job is just to fit in and be as adaptable and flexible as possible. So the opportunities you get to coach them up, or to put on educations about things like, energy system development, strength training, movement competency, whatever it is, like, it's just, you have to know your unit's battle rhythm, their schedule, and fit that in as good as possible. Because if you try to coordinate across an entire brigade where there's 5,000 soldiers and you're hoping to get a handful to come, you're just not going to reach as many, because their sergeant isn't going to sign off on them going to do that for an hour. But so we had one put on, and it was all supposed to be about like the queuing and like these different things around queuing. And it was just painfully, like, it was rough. And there was only one soldier that showed up, and it was from the battalion of the unit that put it on. And we all sat in the back as a staff because we presumed other soldiers might be coming in and they would want to sit near the front. And just the way it was run, the queuing that was used, like it was just something where like, I'm sorry, again, separate the person from the professional. Like professionally speaking, it was not a good presentation. And had my soldiers attended it, like it would not have been a good representation. And then we get chewed out at next week's meeting for sitting in the back of the meeting. And when it was something that we did out of respect for our presumption that soldiers would be attending, at least from the own battalion. But then we get chewed out for that, for sitting in the back. And, we continue to try to force these things, something where, again, that the level of education for a soldier, maybe it was appropriate for them. I still think it could have been much better, structured and run. But then to force that to be something that the rest of your staff has to attend, whether that's in support or to, learn something, if that is the reason, like to me, if you're a full-time coach and you're still having to learn how to teach a squat, I don't fucking know, man. Like it's the same as when you see, all these websites put out the latest top-down progression of how to teach a clean, or, your squatting progression. It's like, oh, wow, you goblet, and then you freehand front squat, and then you front squat, and then you back squat. Like, haven't seen that 50 different times. And so it's like one of those things where we're not interns, like we're full-time professionals. And if as the lead, he feels the direction that these educations need to go is more steered towards an intern level education, then fine. But if you're willing to acknowledge to myself and to some of the other coaches to our face that our educational competency is higher and the job we're doing is objectively higher, that's not an opinion, then why are you forcing us to fit into that same development model? Because inherently that's going to hold us back. But then again, we were, if we spoke out, we did offer ideas, we did offer criticisms, then it became an issue of, how we said things or what we said. And it just kind of got to this point where it felt kind of without purpose. And so we just show up, we check off the box and, throw in our 2 cents there. But beyond that, it just kind of became a frustrating thing. But again, it was certainly something where I had no idea that, and I don't know if that's where my insubordinate behavior was coming from, but it was one of those things where, again, I still contributed in every staff meeting. Even if I didn't agree with them, I'd still offer ideas and questions and whatever. And so then for me to be ousted as a bad employee and as insubordinate when I was fired, like, again, much like you, I'll take ownership for telling my commander if that really was a violation of, our performance work statement. I still stand by my decision to do it. But to be painted in a bad light to my commander and then to the rest of my staff that I was a bad employee, like that is something you're now attacking me on. And I will put my foot in the ground and speak out on that.
Yeah, just don't be a fucking liar. Like that was the biggest thing when I was leaving too. It's like the way they handled it, it was like they will do everything in their power to make it look like they're not the bad guy, or look like they didn't make the hard decision, but it was something that they had to do. Or so, it's like, and then throw it all on the other person. It's like, God, that is the worst way to handle leadership ever. Like, again, like you say, like, and obviously we had 2 different situations, but it's like, if you're going to make the decision, be honest about the decision and tell them why it happened, and don't try to play this other game or this, like, yeah, man, it's so gross.
Yeah. And again, to me, for him to have made the distinction that I was a good coach, but a bad employee. So then the question is, like, are we then more tolerant of good employees and bad coaches? Is that the environment we want? And then 2, and this is my point I always come back to, if I was demonstrating a pattern of insubordination and you as a leader did not feel it was your responsibility to intervene at any point along the way before this last act that apparently was the straw that broke the camel's back, then that reflects poorly of you as a leader.
Exactly.
Because you should see development of your staff, of your subordinates, as a part of your responsibility. Because the lead doesn't have very many coaching responsibilities. It's a lot more administrative. So it's like, if nothing else, that was one of your very few jobs. And you either didn't see it as enough of a problem to intervene, which means then you're kind of making this whole thing up, or you just simply didn't want to acknowledge it and you were okay with that aspect. And so to me, either way, like it sets me up for failure. Because again, I think you talk to any of my previous employers, I have fucked up countless times. I can think of multiple times when I was at NDSU, when I was at Iowa, when I worked in the private sector, like multiple times where I got called out by one of the full-time staff members for fucking up, and rightfully so. And I'm confident in saying that they would all tell you that I would own my shit, I would fix it, and I would do better. Like I am not that, you know, that I don't have that much of an inflated ego to think that I am without fault. But again, especially in the tactical environment, when I'm someone that for 2.5 years now have been in this role, my performance has not been an issue at any point along the way. And it wasn't until a new leader steps in and wants to take things in a different direction that all of a sudden I'm insubordinate because I don't want to go like I don't agree with the direction he's going, even though he's asking us for our opinions. We're then giving it to him and then he's not changing it at all. And then you ultimately decide to fire me. Like it's no longer just a business decision. Like now it's personal. And again, because now you're affecting my livelihood, you're affecting my employment status, all of these things where now going forward, like, oh, were you fired for your last job? Yes. And then now you have to explain why, you have to do all these things. And it's one of those things where when you have to explain it out loud and articulate it to, you know, a different industry entirely, you can kind of just see the cogs in their head turning and like short circuiting, like what's going on in your industry? I'm like, that's a great fucking question. Like, we're all trying to figure that out right now.
Yeah, man, that's crazy. And like what you said, like it's so funny, like when you point out the like logical fallacies that they have, it's like it's almost like they're not even smart enough to realize that they're making them, you know, like it's like where you point out that it's like if this is like if the argument that you're stating is true and you didn't address it, like then that's on you. But it's like they can't even work that far down the road. It's like they just have somebody that they feel is in their way or like an itch on their fucking head that they just need to get rid of, and they have the power to do so. Like, and that's the really messed up thing. It's like how we get to a point in which like leadership is appointed the way it is, to where people that really like you can't logically process what you're saying. Like one step down the road, it looks bad on you and like just doesn't make sense. And you have a leadership role to be able to do that stuff. Like, how scary is that? And like, how far up the chain does that go? Like that incompetence go?
Well, yeah. And it's like, again, if the insubordination was an issue, then why wasn't I told that? Because again, when I was fired, I was told it was because I was publicly advertising my intent to leave or to look for a new job. There was a small little footnote in that conversation about me not wanting to go in the same direction as the rest of the team. But the decision was centered around me having the conversation with my commander and my boss overhearing the commander bring it up to me. Then when my commander goes to have a meeting with him that afternoon, it was all centered around, oh, you're a bad employee, you're insubordinate. And even both my commander and the command sergeant major at that meeting, I had phone calls with each of them that afternoon after they met with him. And both of them even got the vibe that I was, whether it was being scapegoated or if it was like targeted, both of them are like, you know, we know you, we've worked with you. You know, they're trying to paint you in a very bad and unprofessional light. And then they would defer it to like, oh, it was the contracting company's decision. And I'm like, bullshit. You're the one that decided to report this up. Own it. Like this was entirely on you for something so inconsequential. And for someone that has been a contributing member of the staff to not just your staff, but to HF as a whole. And for the life of me, I don't know why this played out the way it did. But it was something that, again, like I'm someone that pours everything I am to who I am as a professional. Like I take a lot of pride in it. And so when you strip that away from me for something so petty, and then you can't even give a straightforward answer to why that is, like that's the most frustrating part of all of this is, again, you took away something that I've invested a lot of time and effort into, and, you know, I've really dedicated the past 2 years of my life for, and you just made a decision on a whim like that. And then you're going to give me one explanation, you're going to give my commander another explanation, and then you're going to cower and deflect and say it was the contracting company's decision. Like you said, you need to own it. And if you can, and you don't have a clear, concise reason, you can't see 2 steps down the road as to how illogical your argument is. It just becomes more and more clear to me that this was a very brass decision. It wasn't well thought through. And again, I can't help but have it feel personal or like it was targeted in some way.
Yeah, it's either incompetence or that. And like that made me reminded me something about St. Thomas. Is like one of the very first things they tried to fire me for. They said I said a bunch of stuff, and I recorded the conversation with one of the assistant athletic directors. I recorded it when he came in because I knew he was going to pull some bit shit, and I heard it. Like people, I had never had a bad talk with him, anything like that. But he's like that politician type. And he can, but coaches had told me over and like, watch him. Like he will do anything. Like he's snaky. He will do anything. And so there was tension building, and he said he wanted to have a talk, and he's like all friendly during this talk. But I was like, well, like, I'm just going to trust like what they told me. So I recorded the whole thing on my phone, kept the audio. And then he got really snaky, started saying a bunch of things. And then I got called into the head athletic director's office. And he said, well, he told me you said all of this, like, if that's true, like, you're gone, and I got to go off his saying. And I was like, well, I got the whole conversation recorded, like, right here, a whole 45-minute conversation on it. So like everything that he is saying is wrong, and you either know it's wrong and it's not true, or you are just listening to the person, and like, so it's like either incompetence or you also are targeting in this direction to make it easy. And that was one of the things that kept me there for 6 months, is because I recorded the whole conversation. It was like, you fuckers, like, and I got super lucky that I did it because people had told me about it. But I was like, and so hopefully this podcast can help like somebody else like with that snaky thing. But it's like, man, like some of the stuff people will do is it kind of like ruins your faith in humanity a little bit sometimes. It's like, man, just anything to make your life easier. And you just have no, like, that's the thing. So like I was lucky enough to have Yoakum Strength, and that was one of the things I made obvious too. It's like, you don't have control over me because I have this thing on the side that I'm able to do. But it's like, if I didn't, like, just because you wanted a power trip, you could take away my job, and I don't have money now. Like, if you have a family, like, and that was the thing that I saw at St. Thomas too. Is like a lot of coaches that thought a lot of the things that I thought, they knew how much on eggshells they were and couldn't say anything. So they didn't, because they had families to feed and they didn't have a secondary source of income. But like, that's the crazy thing too. It's like, you are ruining the person's livelihood. You are willing to take that away for a personal gain, or not even a personal gain, but just like less of a headache, to look more like a leader on the personal level. Like that, this stuff is just blows my mind. It's like, it's almost like you don't understand what that decision does. And you don't understand what it is, obviously. Like, you don't even know why you're making a decision other than like an emotional feeling.
Yeah, for me, the hardest part to wrap my head around is, again, like, this was a guy that, for all intents and purposes, like, seemed to be very smart. Like, we had a lot of, at least in my mind, like, similar thinking towards the constraints of working at H2F. And for me, I think one of the biggest things that I was very adamant about, and I'm sure rubbed people the wrong way, but again, it was coming from the perspective of seeing how things had played out in the collegiate environment and trying to make sure that H2F didn't become that, both in the job satisfaction standpoint, but also in terms of how we operated as professionals and our day-to-day responsibilities. And so one of the things I was very big on and adamant on, and it's something that frustrates me about our industry, but for some reason, there's this idea that, what the client wants or what the customer wants, whatever, is, the most important thing. And I'll say, like, to clarify that statement, our job as coaches, like, depending on the capacity you work in, your job is to help them achieve a certain outcome. At least that's what they're typically coming to you for. On their end, though, as the customer, they need to respect that it's now up to you to determine the processes to get there, because you're going to know the most efficient ways. And not everything they're going to do is going to be stuff that they want to do or is their first choice. But it's like, hey, you've outlined this outcome as your end goal. Here is my subject matter expertise of how to get there. But instead, we play that game where it's like, oh, well, they don't want to do this type of conditioning, or they don't want to do, they don't want to squat or deadlift or do anything with barbells, whatever it is. And then if you as the coach don't, like, compromise and quote unquote meet them halfway, then you're looked at as a bad professional. But for me, as we were coming into the Army, it was, the injury data in the Army is absurd. It's somewhere around 50% of soldiers every year sustain an injury. And I think 72% of them are overuse injuries.
And that's in training.
So it's like, that's just in day to day. Like, if you're active duty military, and it was like a multi-year period they did the study over, but they did a big research paper that was published like 3-4 years ago. And yeah, just across the Army, about 50% of people sustain at least one injury in the year, and 70% of those are overuse injuries. So from our end, it's like, all right, very clearly the first thing we can address is how much we do. And if you were to see a typical weekly regimen of what a soldier does for training, you would not be surprised that overtraining and overuse are like the most common issues you see. Because so they have 90 minutes of training every single morning with their unit, from 6:30 to 8. That's kind of a mandated thing across the Army, although, like, mandated is not the right word for it, but it's an expectation. And then on top of that, soldiers are encouraged to go train on their own in the afternoon as well. So you have these 18 to 30-year-old guys and girls that some of them have backgrounds in athletics, some of them have zero background, and they're immediately jumping into two-a-days. And we're not talking about like 2 40-minute workouts at the appropriate intensity scale. It's like you're doing high volume running, rucking, push-ups, intervals, whatever in the morning, and then you're bro splitting it in the afternoon. And then you're supplementing that with terrible nutrition, caffeine addictions, poor sleep, like all these different things where it's like it's a melting pot for, yeah, this is basically every risk factor for overtraining. You guys have combined them all and like adopted it wholesale. And so when we came in, for me, that was the biggest thing is like, hey, like we're science based, like we have the evidence on our side to say what we're doing traditionally is not working. We need to change that. And I was someone that was very adamant that like the more and more we try to meet them halfway, because I was having a lot of these conversations with our soldiers, with our officers, all different ranks, and you would ask them what they wanted to do, it would always steer back towards the old school Army and the conventional way of training that we were trying to get away from. And the point I was very strong on is that the more and more we dilute our product, or the more and more we try to meet them halfway, the more we just end up doing things the way they're always done. And like I understand that the Army is very, they'll tell you themselves, like they're very set in their ways. They're very routine and structured. It's part of what makes the Army what it is that structure, that routine. But when we can say that there's an objective reason to make a change, and we come in as these subject matter experts, if we're now deferring to people who don't have the college education, don't have the athletic background, and we're just deferring to them because they're active duty, I do think we're doing them a disservice. Even though on the relationship side, we might not be their favorite person up front, it's still our responsibility to train them, to prepare them for the demands of combat, for the demands of their job. And, sometimes the carrot, sometimes the stick. But I think when you're at the ground level of a project this big, it's going to expand to the entire Army over the next decade, and it's going to be around for decades to come. Those people that are at the very ground level of it have a responsibility to set the path off in the right direction and to really push the narrative and to hold their ground firm. Otherwise, we open the boundaries up too much, and 2, 3, 4 years down the road, there is no clear consensus on what is training, what are we trying to do, how do we quantify and prepare for the demands of combat. And instead, it turns into just the CrossFit shit show that it's historically been. And, again, it's like we are hired to do a job. Come in and do your job. If you can't, if you don't want to hold your ground on that, then I'm of the opinion that you should not be in this position, because it's great work-life balance. It's great pay relative to the collegiate environment. You get to work with some really cool, individuals across the board, really cool opportunities. So it should be that much easier to do your job at an exceptionally high level. But that wasn't happening. And that's just something that fundamentally, from a professional standpoint, I can't stand by and just pretend to be okay with.
Yeah, and one of the things too with professionals, like you're working with professionals, you're working with soldiers, man. Like if you get them results, like it's going to be a pushback to start. But like at the end of the day, it's just like working with a professional athlete or any athlete. If you're getting them results, eventually they're going to start adopting what you want to do, like, so it's like the process of like when they feel better, like somebody, especially in the Army's boots, like that's where it's like you can totally, because the wrestlers is the closest I can relate it to, because like wrestlers are very like, it's very similar, like CrossFit bullshit, like grind mentality, like grabbing onto what they want to do. But you get a wrestler to just train the right way, and they're an actual competitive wrestler, and you just make them feel better with faster results. They don't feel like shit all the time, regardless of how much they love that grind mentality. As soon as you get them feeling better and moving better, they always adopt what you want to do. Like they always just accept it. So it's like, it's same as like working with like a child. Like you can't just let the child, like they just like they don't know what they're doing. Like they just, well, of course they're gonna go eat candy all day if you let them eat candy all day. But it's like as soon as you show them like what it can be like with the wrestlers, and I know it's like, again, that's not comparing them, they're not soldiers, but it's the closest I can get to who I train with.
There's similar cultures there. Like,
yeah,
it's in terms of the mindset, it's similar.
And once you get them feeling good, like they adopt what you want to do anyway. So it's like, it's totally right. Like the results matter, and especially when it's a life or death fucking situation in what you're working with, like that should be the number one thing. Like it's not even fucking getting pinned on a mat anymore, where like, okay, I can meet them halfway to get them there. It's like that could be a life or death situation that you're training this soldier for, and you're gonna like you're gonna battle that because it's how it's been done. Like that is so insane.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I went through, when I worked with wrestling at NDSU, it's the same thing. Like I didn't, want to program circuits or anything. And the guys, like, you can ask any of the guys I worked with when I first started the team. First 6 months, like 90% of them fucking hated me. It wasn't like a subtle, like I was picking up the vibes. It was very clear they hated me. Partially because of the changes in training we want to make in terms of the organization, the structure, the attention to detail, but then also more importantly, like having standards for behavior, for conduct. And I didn't care if you were, top 20 guy or a redshirt freshman, like here's a standard, no one's above it, right? And with the training too, the conversation I had was, and it was a very open conversation because that's how I always operate is, you're an athlete, you're a soldier, this is part of your training. If I can't explain to you, we shouldn't be doing it. And I told them, like, I need you guys to give me these next few months. If you don't like where you're at physically, you don't feel better, you don't feel stronger, more importantly, you're not performing your best on the mat, we will sit down and we will discuss and I will bring you guys into the conversation and you guys can have influence over programming. But you have to do everything to a T for these next few months and then report back to me. A couple months later, not a single complaint. And like it got to the point where because, communicating to guys, hard days and easy days, when I need them to push, how I'm looking at their competition schedule, their weight cut schedule, all those things. Once they started to see that those were all the pieces I was factoring in, it became so much easier for me to tell them like, hey, we had a duel on Sunday and then we've got a duel Friday, Saturday, but I need us to get a hard lift in on either Tuesday or Wednesday. Which day do we want to get it in on? And I need you guys to push. Like we need to get the stimulus in because we haven't been able to hit a heavy day in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is. This is our best opportunity. Which one do you want? And once they saw that collaboration, but also that thing of me being like, this isn't me trying to force a square peg into a round hole. This is just me trying to figure out where to put that square peg in because we've got to get it in. I just need your guys' input on what you want to do it. And guys' willingness to push themselves and challenge themselves, even guys who historically hated the weight room on that wrestling team, they started to come around and they were now pushing themselves and having fun and enjoying it. And it came from that results piece. And, seeing the numbers going up is obviously a big piece. But for those guys, like you said, the feeling better thing is such a huge component. And that's where the military has a ton of parallels because the amount of guys you will talk to that when they describe their list of injuries, both current and historically, you would think they're like 45, 50 years old and have, done multiple tours in, the Middle East. And it turns out it's just like a 25, 26-year-old guy that's never been deployed. Like he's been on a few rotations to a few training centers, but it's just all through PT. And probably one of the biggest like facts that blows people away about the military setting during the war in the Middle East, I think it's specifically in Afghanistan, the number one reason for medical evacuations while we were there is physical training. It wasn't even fucking combat. And so it's like, even when we're in an active war and we're deployed, we're out overseas, still the thing that shoots us the most is ourselves in the foot. And, you put all that out there and it's like, guys, there's a need for change. And that's where, again, us as, subject matter experts coming in, the change has been identified. It's now on us to hold the ground firm on that and start to chip away and push back on it because, the spectrum's been moved all the way over here in terms of what's deemed to be good training. And it's both in wrestling and the military. It's just quite literally, how hard is it? If it's hard, it's good. If I'm out of breath, if I'm exhausted, if my legs can't move, it's a good workout versus what's sustainable, what's repeatable, and what's actually developing you long term.
That's insane. That fact you dropped. That's nuts. I did not know. I would never even. I knew the injury rate was crazy, but the number one thing when you're in a war, that is absolutely nuts.
Yeah, and and obviously, again, you feel for these guys on a human level, right? It's because one, it's a selfless act, whether they're volunteering for service because they wanted to, or for some of them they didn't have better options, so they went to the military, right? End of the day, it's a ballsy decision, and you go through a very strenuous lifestyle being in the military. But we have to work away from normalizing those things. And for me, it's one thing when you're in garrison. So garrison is just when you're at your base. When you're in garrison and, you're training a lot, you're going out to ranges, you're going out to the field to do different FTXs, field training exercises, all these things, it's like I would expect physical training, PT, to be probably one of your higher causes of injuries, but it still should not be that high. I don't know about you, but in all my time working in the collegiate setting, I think I had 2 injuries, like somewhat significant injuries ever And one of them was a shoulder dislocation because we were doing push jerks with a kid that failed to tell me he had a history of shoulder dislocations. So it's like training, like injuries should not be a normal part of training. Like you should obviously be straining, you should be pushing, you should be challenging yourself. But if you're constantly like beat up, battered, and bruised, one, from just a general standpoint, that's a bad idea. But then two, for these guys, like if a war were to break off, if something with Ukraine and Russia were to develop, or with China, Taiwan, all these different, global political issues we're having right now, if something happens and our unit is called to respond, you can get as little as 72 hours notice, which means whatever you're feeling right now, if that's not going to clear up and be 100% 3 days from now, you're now going in as a liability to yourself and therefore to the rest of your squad, your platoon, your company, the unit at large. And so that's something where it's like, again, you have to help them, save them from themselves, because these guys want to work hard. They want to put in the effort. But, as we know, if it was as simple as do more work, get better results, we probably wouldn't even be sitting here having this conversation. We wouldn't need a fucking job. There's an art and there's a science to what we do. Our job as professionals is to educate and to show them that way. But I think it's a lot easier to show people the way to do it, show them the right way, and educate over time versus trying to educate up front and wait for them to believe in it. Because how do they filter out good from bad ideas?
So that's one thing that I was really interested in. Then is like, how do you do this? Like what does that? Okay, I kind of a two-parter. Like, what did it end up looking like for you? Like, where did you get it to? Like, because I know that guarantee there was pushback to like your ideal situation, but like, where did you get it to? What did it look like? You said you got a lot of results that weren't like arguable. So like, was it injury rates? Was it like numbers? So like, and what did the training look like too? Because you talk about sometimes you'll have like 90 guys with no equipment, like back to the fucking COVID days of Division III level. Like we were 120 guys on the field and we didn't have shit. So like all of that stuff. And then two, and I'll rephrase it if the first part goes a little bit too long, but I'll come back to it too. Is like, what ideally overall would it have looked like if you had full control and you didn't have to carrot and stick it, if you did at all? So like that two-part question, what's that going to look like?
We'll start with the ideal model because it'll be easier to paint that out, and then we can do to what actually happened, to Instagram versus reality.
Yeah.
So Instagram version is, and this again is my belief, and some of it runs counter to the initial intent with which HStrep was written, but that's, I think, part of developing a program this large. For me, for it to be successful, one is you need clear line of communication from the very top of the Army all the way down to the lower enlisted ranks of why we're here, and most importantly, what our job is. Because even once we got dropped in, there was no clear idea about what we were supposed to do, how we were supposed to be utilized. There was still a ton of pushback and belief within our unit and many other units around the country that we were not supposed to be in charge of programming or coaching during training. And
what were you supposed to do?
That's a phenomenal fucking question. And that again goes to show, like, one, the importance of us as professionals holding our ground, but two, more importantly, with any type of change, it's one thing to identify the need for change. But before you get to the actual step of creating change, if it's solely top down and it's not understood throughout, then you're going to have too much resistance at the middle and bottom levels. And fundamentally, the issue within the tactical setting is, like, we are not, as coaches, facilitating, like, we're not running any workouts. Like, that is something where even in the ideal model, it wouldn't be sustainable. Because again, there's maybe two coaches for, and the size of your unit's going to vary depending on the type of brigade you are. So like our brigade, we were a striker brigade. It's one of, if not the largest brigades across the entire United States military. So we have 5,000 soldiers, 14 total coaches. So for my unit, for my unit specifically, my battalion, we had about 750 soldiers. And for the overwhelming majority of the time, it was either myself or one other coach. So you're talking about one coach for roughly 375 to 400 athletes. And so again, that's where it's most closely synonymous with like your Division III environment, where you might have one coach, maybe some interns if you're lucky, but usually not much of a staff. But the only difference is Division III, you can schedule teams throughout the day. Army, everyone trains from 6:30 to 8. So you don't get that luxury. But
is that something you would change in your ideal model?
It's something, not only something I would change, it's something that has been done.
Okay.
at different units across the Army. And this is where, again, like people talk about, the Army needing to change and how much they're willing to invest into, into H2F and into their fitness. So there's nothing in doctrine that says PT has to go from 6:30 to 8. And historically speaking, it was almost never even done at that time because, and there was a paper written in-house in the Army, I think it was like 60 years ago, 70 years ago, that talked about why training early isn't optimal and like counterintuitive to not only to the most optimal results, but also to, the Army's big on, people first and developing the soldier and physical fitness being a part of that. And so the soldier's duty day falls between the hours of, 9:30 till, whenever they get off, typically about 1700. So like 900 to, 1700, give or take. And they've got lunch in there and then they'll have dinner. But when you put something like physical training outside of their traditional duty day, you are now giving the kind of the idea that it's an ancillary responsibility. So although physical fitness is a core part of your job, it's not an essential enough part of your job for us to bake it into the duty day. And with how limited our equipment is, that would be the most feasible solution because, ideal world, we were supposed to get these 40,000 square foot facilities with, racks lining the walls, turf, dumbbells, all these things. Instead, you get this little container box, 8-foot container box, and in it you have 4 straight bars, 4 trap bars, low handle only, and then you have 8 of each bumper plate. So 8 45s, 35s, 25s, and 10s, and 5-pound plates if you're lucky. It's designed to train 50 people, and you have 200 people that have to share this same box. And then there's like some battle ropes, some kettlebells, sleds, and shit like that. But it's something we're like, okay, logistically, guys, the math is not mathing. So if we can't get more equipment, because trying to get more equipment funding is a, shit show in and of itself, and we're not willing to, train over multiple times throughout the day, like we're really pigeonholing ourselves here into a really rough spot. So to kind of the easy synopsis of what the model should be is 1, multiple training times throughout the day. If you're not going to get the facilities to allow it. And then within that, all of the training needs to be written by the strength conditioning coach. There's still this idea that NCO should be responsible for programming and writing stuff. To me, it's just, it's holding on to the past. Like you have this qualified professional, let them do their job. What you do need NCOs to be able to do, your non-commissioned officers, which is all of your sergeants that actually run the training, they all need to be trained up at a high level on how to teach movements, how to coach them, how to correct them, and how to read the training card, or, we were using Team Builder, read the app and run the workout and be able to do it themselves. And then also keep their guys up to speed. And if they can do those things, to me, this thing is extremely easy because of how it is very easy to make this scalable. But when you have guys that are more concerned about what their leg day is that afternoon or the leg day they did yesterday. So like, oh, I can't lift at PT this morning because I had squats yesterday. And it's like, you did that on your own time. Like this is the workout we're doing. Whether you like it or not, like we're not going to adjust for one guy, but getting it to that point. And then ultimately, I think having that continual trust from all levels of leadership of why we're doing things and why we need to have this centralized, uniformed approach, because everyone wants to think they need their individualized training and their specialized routines. And the analogy I always like to refer back to is like the level we're at in the military, and even for most people, is synonymous with your K through 12 education, where it doesn't matter what you want to go to college for, what you want to do for a living. Like everyone needs these core competencies to be a well-rounded, just academic. And then you can go in and specialize when you go into college, when you go into your master's degree. But it doesn't matter what you want to go into. You should still learn social studies, science, English, reading, math, like all those different things. And they should be built up progressively over time. Like we don't just throw a kindergartner into calculus, but then if you enlist in the Army, you go through basic training and then you get put on your first duty station, you're just thrown into training the next day. And like if your squad is doing 4x10 back squats supersetted with 200-meter sprints, that's what you're doing. And you might have never worked out in your life. And so it's like, it's a recipe for disaster. So in terms of how we navigated that and, stuff, I'd put together myself, I'd put together with other coaches, was the first thing we did to solve it was create an entire menu of what each box had, because they all had 95% the same equipment. So built a tracker on a spreadsheet in Google Sheets, had all of it listed, and then from there started to create our workout plan across the week, with the idea being that, so within our traditional line companies, you're going to have 4 platoons. So platoon is about 45 soldiers, give or take. Each platoon is going to have 4 squads. And so that's kind of the easy hierarchy. So all the way down to the lowest level, you have your teams. Teams is anywhere from about 3 to 5 guys. A squad is made up of 2 to 3 teams. So that's about 10 to 12. Platoon is 4 squads. And then a company, it can be a certain amount of platoons, but typically around 3 to 4. So what we did is we created a schedule where Monday through Thursday, we had a rotating 4-day schedule. So we had one primary strength and power day, one strength endurance / work capacity day. We had a tactical PT day because they had to do 1 day of PT with their green suits on, with their kits on and everything, because sport specific. We had a long duration run day. And then our 5th day, which would be a Friday, would be either some type of ruck march that they would do as a unit, or would have open up for like sports PT or, squad comps, platoon comps, whatever it was. And so that Monday through Thursday just operated where our first platoon would do our high intensity day 1, second platoon would do low intensity 1, third platoon would do high intensity 2, fourth platoon would do that run day. And then the next day over, everyone would shift 1 day right. And then they would just run that. And then that way with, how often, a unit might get pulled out into the field or have to go out to ranges or get put into, detail. It didn't mess up the rest of the unit schedule. And we could always account for what equipment was being utilized, where was it being utilized, and then, what do we need for setup? And so then my idea was in the direction I was hoping to take it. And we saw bits and pieces of it before our unit went off to Korea for about 9 months for a rotation. But my idea was about 90 to 95% of the programming has to be very just uniform from block to block, because again, I only have 8 of each bumper plate. And so, if I have a squad of 12 guys, and let's say I have 2 barbells going, because I've also got 30 other guys in that platoon that are training. If I try to have all 4 bars going, I can put 145, 135, 125, and 110 on each side of the bar. But you have guys that are deadlifting 300, 400 pounds. So how am I supposed to provide an adequate enough stimulus for them if I'm putting up 4 barbells? So instead, you have to have 2 barbells going here.
You can't even use all your equipment.
No, it's not feasible to do it, which again is why I liked having all that stuff plotted out and put up on a spreadsheet, because then when I was pitching it to our leadership and also discussing with soldiers, it wasn't like, hey, this is the program we're doing because this is the only way I would program. This is the, Mladen Jovanovic bottoms up programming. What do I have here and now? How can I execute this to at least, my minimum viable product, right? And over time, it would be great to grow it. But hey, we need to see what works, what doesn't work, what can we iterate, going forward. And then if we do get more equipment, then fuck yeah, like that opens up. We can start bench pressing. Even though you guys already do it 4 times a week on your own, we'll throw in some bench press. Like we'll do all these different things. But if we have these general themes and we have these general blocks, or like strength and power day, we would break it up into 4 different blocks. It'd be a lower body strength block, which is almost always a trap bar deadlift, because that was the movement that was tested for their ACFT. We'd have an upper body push block. We'd have an upper body pull block, and then some type of total body power. So it'd be some medicine ball throws, some jumps, plows, what have you. And we would just have 1 squat at each block. And they'd have about 12 to 15 minutes per block to get in, be a main movement, 2 to 3 accessories. And then you'd have 15 minutes to get through it. You'd rotate to the next block, rotate to the next block. So you get a couple minutes in between. And over the course of, you get 90 minutes to train. So you spend 15 minutes warming up. You've got 4 15-minute blocks, a couple minutes in between. There's your 90-minute session right there. And so we tried to structure everything we did in, by breaking down into 4s or into 2s. So that way we could keep those core elements of the unit structure intact, whether it's at the squad level or the platoon level. But then we still need to account for that, individualization need of, within 1 squad of guys, you might have a kid that can barely deadlift 135 pounds. And then, we have PLs, lieutenants, who are former Division I football players. And they're going to be in the same squad training together on the same equipment. And it's like, all right, how do I provide as much variability as possible? But at the end of the day, like, you guys have to take this on yourself to be like, hey, you shouldn't be lifting that much weight. Let's help them take the weight off, put the right weight on, coach them up in technique, all those things. And we started to see that working. We tried to roll it out before our guys went off to Korea. And then they spent 9 months out in Korea, and it was during the middle of winter. They had no indoor facilities to utilize there. And so it was like below 0 degrees, and they're training outside. It's snowing. The air quality is absolute shit because it blows across the water from China. And it's like they'd have days like the air quality was so bad that they'd go outside to go for a run, and guys would tell me their lungs were burning like 10 minutes into it. And they're asking for, oh, what's a modification? What can we do? And I was like, I don't know, fucking put on your gas mask and go run with that. Like, I'm like, when I go through my education, like, we presume 4 walls and a roof is kind of like the bare minimum of what we're used to training with. There's just certain conditions where like there is no modification for that. But through that though, we still learned a lot in terms of and I learned a ton in terms of how adaptable and flexible I can be. And also just some like non-conventional ideas for training. Like at one point, when our guys got back from Korea, the boat with all of our equipment on it had been delayed. It got stuck at one of the ports in customs, and that boat had all of our equipment. So all of our lifting equipment, everything. So we had 800 guys back, absolutely no fucking equipment for like weeks and months on end. So I had to borrow from Kali Muscle and his video with Dom Mazzetti, where they were doing workouts with like a towel or a trash bag, and they're doing like tricep extensions and biceps, and was trying to find all these. And I remember you did a post on like different ways to do like just partner manual resistance exercises, and we tried to implement them, but ultimately like what the failure was, like a lot of things in this setting, is it doesn't work if the guys don't put intent into it. And it's very hard to get them to buy into something that is so non-traditional because you don't have the ability. Like I, as a civilian, cannot motherfuck them if they're not putting in effort.
Yeah.
And, as a coach, that's even a big challenge because, I'm not the drill sergeant screaming type of guy, but I am someone where like either you put in effort or you get the fuck out. Like I'm not going to coach that up in you. You just need to show up and do it. But you can't do that because there is rank, there is a chain of command. And so you need your NCOs to do that. But then if you have NCOs that don't want to do that, they don't have that leadership ability, or they just don't know how to be commanding in that regard and be constructive, then it dies on the spot. And it's such a tough thing to navigate and to envision yourself in. And the easiest way I like to convey it to people, especially those coming from a collegiate background, it would be like you going to work in at St. Thomas, and instead of you writing the programs that all of your athletes run, you can give them a program and they can follow it if they want. Otherwise, they can run their own shit. But if you do give them the program, you just have to give it to them with almost no explanation. Like you can do a quick 1 hour, 2 hour explanation, but then at that point, they're just running it entirely on their own, and they got to take the rest of their team through that program.
It's like the Division III summers.
Yeah, and at least then you have barbells and dumbbells and kettlebells and all these things. I'm like, there's only so many different ways where you can, do these movements, and also make sure guys aren't standing around too much, because that's a big thing in Army culture. If you're standing around, it's not a good look. So it's like, how do we keep people looking busy? How do we try to do things that they're not going to do in their own workouts? And so, trying to do stuff like isometrics, doing different, core and torso variations, some mobility, some corrective stuff, whatever you want to call it. Because I know that especially being in an infantry unit, a lot of these guys are going to the gym in the afternoon and they're doing your traditional bro splits. They're doing your upper lower, like they're getting all the lifting volume in. So what am I going to do by adding more into the morning and trying to pile on? In terms of results we saw though, even with the kind of less than stellar execution of it. So when I had taken over for the unit, we were kind of like, our unit was called 423, 4th Battalion, 23rd Infantry. We were laughably in first place in the injury rate across the entire brigade. So like there's a graph, and I still have it saved in my computer somewhere. It is a little bar graph, just injuries over a multi-month period. And you're like every other battalion that was like here. And then 423 is like fucking way up here. It literally just looked like a middle finger on the graph to everybody else. Like, fuck you guys, we're number one. And we had a period, it was about 7 months ago, late winter, early spring. And it's actually something our commander brought to my attention, because he brought it up to the entire brigade at one of their meetings with all the commanders. We were now the lowest in the entire brigade in injury rates. And since that point, we've stayed near the bottom of injury rates. And so the irony has been like, as soldiers have been telling us in my own unit, like, oh, the program's not working, or, all this of like, oh, it's just not good enough. It's like, well, your injury rates have gone down. And for the, ACFT data we have on you guys, most of your fitness scores are going up. Because the ACFT wasn't officially the test of record until last October. The Army was changing its test from the push-ups, sit-ups, and running to the new fitness test, which is a trap bar deadlift, an overhead med ball throw, an event called the sprint drag carry, push-ups. It was what was called the leg tuck, which is like a hanging leg raise. They changed it to the plank because people couldn't do one leg tuck, and then a 2-mile run, and you do all that in a 90-minute window. But we had people who we would train, and we would see over like a 6-week period, we'd see 30, 40, 50-point improvements in these events. We'd see the injury rates go down. We'd see the buy-in go up. But it was just one of those things where if you don't have everyone bought in top to bottom, and I don't know why I said bottom like that, throw in an accent. But if you have everyone bought in top to bottom and you can help them see like the purpose, the direction, what's going on. We had a couple platoons that were running our training at a very high level, and we could go out there and they would have everything set up. You'd have leaders that are instructing guys where to go, how to get in lines. You would see them getting after them on intent. It was like everything you envisioned it could be, but it was in those small pockets. And it was because like the one group that was kind of our gold standard, that was a group I had worked with individually for about 5 months, because that was at the very early stages of when I got on board. And they were the only unit that wanted to work with me. And so I was like, all right, well, I'll get all the results with you guys. We'll build things up here. I'd gotten his squads ACFT average. They went from like a 519 out of 600 to a 547 in a couple months span. So like consistent improvements across the board. And they had guys with some pretty significant improvements in all the events. And so we had all those pockets of evidence to show like, hey, if you do this right, it does work. But then it still just got met with a lot of friction and frustration, because they wanted more variability. They wanted more autonomy. They wanted the workouts to change weekly. And it was one of those things where it's like, you guys can't run the workouts we're doing right now for months on end. You can't run those right, but you want to do more complexity and variation. Like, yeah, we're putting the cart before the horse here, and we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And so that was kind of where things were at. And we were, before my untimely exit, we were in the process of doing a lot of educations and workshops in anticipation of all the equipment coming back, being usable, and trying to get guys up to speed on how to run the program. We had some changes in leadership and some people that were at least open to making the thing work. And so I was really excited about the direction that was going to go. Ultimately, don't get to see how it played out, but still learned a lot in the process. And I think still through the stuff I put together, the stuff I shared online, collaborated with others on, like I've felt good about the direction I tried to push things, and also provided to others and have gotten that feedback from them that, again, trying to create the scalability within your programming that you need in this environment is truly one of the most unique and fun challenges. So it was nice to get away from, should we front squat or back squat? Should we Olympic lift or not Olympic lift? And it was just to like, how the fuck do I get all 200 guys to run a program that is somewhat holistic and like has enough scalability built into it, but it's not going to be perfect, because I'm type A as fuck. So I hate when something's not run the way I want it to be, or doesn't look the way I want it to be. So learning to let go of that and be much more adaptable, I think, was one of the biggest things I took away from this entire experience.
So towards the end, were you able to were you able to program, or was it more the consulting where you laid out what the day kind of template should look like, and then the officers program during that day? And if you did program, did you have to do all 4 days of like, you had to program the running and the rucks and all of that, or like what was that kind of like?
So yeah, so our current commander, Colonel McLaughlin, who phenomenal human, he came in June of last year. And it was actually right around he came in like 2 weeks prior to when I had my jaw surgery and was out of commission for like 3 weeks. So I was like, hey, great to meet you, sir. By the way, I'm gonna be out for a month here. But he came in, and prior to his time being the commander of our unit, he actually worked over at the Pentagon. And so the unique thing about him coming in was he saw all of the quantitative side of what H2F does. He saw the reductions in injury rates, the saving in, patient care costs, the, reduction in missed duty days, all those things that the Army cares about immensely. But he never saw the actual implementation of it, because they didn't have any H2F teams there. So when he got to our unit, and at the time we were only programming for 7% of the unit, because that was all we could get, he just flat out says like, why are you guys not programming for everyone? And we're like, we weren't given the autonomy. We weren't given, the order wasn't pushed out that, hey, they're going to run training. And then it was like, hey, he's like, all right, so if I do that, are you guys ready? We're like, yep, we got it. And so we had full autonomy over every detail. It was our plan. We provided the ruck guidance, the running distances or the volumes, the pacing, lifting, sets, reps, exercises. Everything was done through us. And there was a good and bad about that, because we wanted to go the approach of like, hey, roll this out slowly. Let's make sure it's done right. But also because our unit was going on a 9-month rotation in October of that year, we really only had about 2.5 months to get as much of it out as we could. So we tried to onboard as many of our platoons as possible. We'd have myself, the other coach I was working with at the time, Ryan Gibson, who's still in the brigade, but he's at a different battalion now. Phenomenal guy. He and I would basically go with a different platoon. And for 2 weeks, we would onboard them. The first week, we would run every single aspect of the training for the entire group of 40 to 45 guys.
So you would coach them then?
Week, yeah. And
awesome.
So our commander and our command sergeant major were like, again, there was what the higher ups thought. And it was a lot of, it's kind of like any of the model. Like the higher up you go, the older the person is, the more outdated their ideas are. And so like when I referenced earlier how there's like units that said like, oh, we don't want you writing programming, we don't want you coaching. That exact line was fed to our command sergeant major, who he had just come from Ranger Regiment. And he came into my office and he's like, so I just sat in a meeting where I found out you guys aren't supposed to coach and you're not supposed to write workouts. So I just want to ask you, what the fuck are you supposed to do? So like, and that was like that breath of like fresh air and sanity of, okay, I'm not crazy. Like this is not normal. Because at Ranger Regiment, like they have a much more advanced version of what HF is trying to be, as well as much better facilities, all that shit. But so he had the opportunity to like see what it works like in that setting, and then how do we scale it to this setting? And he's been so helpful and beneficial throughout my entire 2 years, or I was with him for about 1.5 years. Just the amount of advice and guidance he could provide on like how to get ideas to gain traction, or how to tailor my messaging to make it a little bit more understandable to the soldiers, because you speak in, the exercise science vernacular and you lose them. But if you can find a way to relate it to their battle drills or different squad movements they might have, or individual movements, now you're speaking their language, and now at least conceptually they can understand where you're coming from. It was the same reason I did that whole Instagram post about how training is like alcohol, because in the Army, everyone understands alcohol. And so it was like, that was the easy way of like, all right, guys, fucking doing your squats and snatches and everything in one day, that's taking back-to-back shots of Jaeger. Not a good idea, right? And so, yeah, by having them both bought in, and they told us from day one, if you get any flack from brigade leadership, from division, whoever, like we'll take the fall on it. Like that'll come back on us. Just you guys do your job, coach them up, get them up to speed, with the idea being that we're going to train these guys on how to run the program, and then we're going to send them back out to be able to execute it on their own. But it's a lot harder for me to try to verbally walk them through everything that the program needs to be and how to run it, versus let me just physically show you and teach you it as we're going. And yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but if it gets us 70% of the way there, that's manageable. And then at that point, once we got everyone up to speed, Ryan and I could double back, check up on platoons, and clean things up, coach things up, help them out, and continue to get the whole process kind of figured out and streamlined. And then from there, we could start to look at deviations, at iterations of the programming. But still, I'm of the belief that just due to the chaotic training schedule, due to the chaotic training ages and the resources available, like we don't have the bandwidth and the flexibility to have these like programs that are changing every week or even every month. And it's something I absolutely don't like as a coach. Like I like some variability, but until we get more resources, like, hey, this is what we have. Like there's still some options for variability built in, but let's just get good at these few things and do them extremely well, versus being mediocre at 20, 30 things.
Yeah. How did you learn all the like rock programming and things like that? Like was that kind of a process? Because like going from strength conditioning to like, I feel like that's like a big kind of new piece of the puzzle. Like I don't know if I would know how to obviously you can learn it, but I don't know if I could know how to program that right now.
One, like everything else, obviously I'm a big research guy. I'm a big reading guy. So that was the first thing is, reading, figuring out, what's the injury data on it? What's the, what are the actual physical demands? And I think that was one of the biggest things I tried to push for early on is with all of our training, we need to prepare you for you. Like, it is our job to prepare you for your job. And so, within something like ruck marching, and this was kind of one of those things, like, I had to battle constantly throughout. So there's a big test in the Army. It's called the 12 miler. And it's basically you have 35 pounds in your rucksack. You have a mock weapon in your hands. And then you have to ruck 12 miles in 3 hours. So it's a 4 mile an hour pace, which is in 35 pounds of gear, like you're moving. But the thing about that test, and everyone trains for it, but the thing about that test is it doesn't reflect combat demands in any way, shape, or form. Like, the average infantryman during Afghanistan and Iraq carried 101 pounds on their back. And the speeds they move at are like a mile an hour to 2 miles an hour, because you're on patrols and you just have all this load. So you have to move very slowly. And so the Army had created all these tests that didn't reflect the demands of what they were doing. And that's where, one, we tried to bring it back to, all right, rucking and running are the two biggest causes of injury. So we need to be careful how much we do this, because guys would do it either every single week or multiple times a week, or there's just no progression to what they did. So it'd be, hey, we're just going to go out and do an 8 mile ruck with 80 pounds on our back. And it's like, oh, why do we have all these shin splints and low back pain issues? It's like, you're running 20 miles a week also. And so, yeah, I mean, once I got it, like, there's a ton of really solid literature published within different branches of the Army. There's a guy who's based out of Australia, I believe, Rob Orr. He puts out a ton of phenomenal research that actually looks and quantifies the physiological demands imposed by ruck marching and how frequently you need to do it, what loads, what speeds, all those things. And then a lot of it was also having conversations. So as a part of the H2F team, we have civilians and we have active duty officers as well. And so there was a guy, Major Naylor, who he's now out in North Carolina, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. He moved out east. But he was, like, historically has done a phenomenal job of training his body. He was the direction of injury control for our team. And so he had the medical background, but he also had the applied experience of being a soldier and actually physically going through the preparation for this. So had a ton of conversations with him early on. He gave us some advice on, should you progress load? Should you progress pace, volume? Like, what do you need? And then, even down to some nuances of, like, how do you teach pacing strategies when you go on ruck marches? How do you teach the proper way to wear your ruck, to use all the straps, to put your load in the rucksack, to make sure that it's as, ergonomically efficient as possible, so that you're mitigating against the low back issues, the knee issues, the shin issues. And then it also tied into what eventually became my big thing of, the deep dive I did down in conditioning and aerobic training and all that, and looking at a lot of, and especially taking from alpine athletes and how they train, and ski mountaineers and those types of athletes that cover a lot of incline. They'll usually have some type of load, but ultimately it just requires a tremendous amount of muscular endurance and tolerance to just high volumes of work, and stealing from those guys and how they program. And it was just about bringing those principles together. And so it was stealing from different ideas mixed with, my own intuition, my own understanding, and then even my own application as, someone who I, rarely ever ruck marched. But obviously with my whole kick on the zone 2, the low intensity stuff that gets bastardized and thrown around now, I had gone out for a ruck march with our guys one day while we were back here with our rear detachment group that didn't go forward to Korea, and threw a 50-pound sandbag in my backpack. I had a little hiking pack, so I had a chest strap and everything. Went out with the guys and held like a 15-30 pace, and my heart rate barely broke above 110 beats per minute. And that was the third time I had rucked all year. And so kind of my general idea with it is that rucking is an expression of two things: your strength and your conditioning, generally speaking. It is not a good developer of those. It's kind of very similar to how I view Olympic lifting, where I view them better, and this might be controversial, I think they're better expressions of power and movement and competency than developers necessarily. And that's something like I've even tried myself of doing a lot of like loaded jumps and plows and explosive stuff, and then still seeing my clean numbers go up, even though I don't ever train them. Rucking I see is very similar, where rucking to get better at rucking is typically not the best way to go forward, because it's not enough of a strength stimulus, and it's hard to manage the intensity of the exercise you need to be at while accumulating that volume, versus develop the lower body strength, the torso strength, the upper body strength to support that load to hold it, develop the conditioning through your low impact means, cycling, incline walking, stair climb, whatever, to build up the volume in that aerobic system. And then every so often you can, wave in something like a ruck march every 2 to 4 weeks, just to, the movement economy aspect, the exposure to the task itself. But it does need to be something you train regularly. And I think even seeing that myself, being able to hold a 15-minute mile without my heart rate going above 110 is kind of a testament to that, because all I had done up to that point was just, 4 to 6 hours a week of low intensity conditioning, and then my strength training work as usual. And I was still going out to hold a pace that most guys struggle to maintain without getting into the 140s, 150s, 160s.
That's kind of sick. The low high model just applied too. Like, it's just same like the middle ground bullshit in sport. That's what kind of rucking is for the Army.
Well, and for an occupation like the Army, that's where I think it's exponentially more important, because, you worked with football guys for a while, and it's like, all right, we know the number of plays in a drive, number of drives per game, rest per play, all those things. There are no work to rest ratios of being a soldier. Like, if you end up in a combat situation, the Taliban's not on the other side of the hill, right? Like, all right, 2-minute break, guys. We'll cut out, grab some water. We'll hit it back hard. Like, you could be there for hours. And so when you talk about preparing somebody for unknown demands, and again, that's what sent me down that rabbit hole of conditioning, is like, how do you prepare somebody to be as, from an energy system standpoint, robust to unknown demands and to the range of tasks they can come across. And it did just come back to, like, you need a metric fuck ton of volume. And then it gets into like, all right, well, how do you accumulate that volume in a safe manner? And so you start to look at, how impactful is the activity you're doing? Is it running versus cycling? What's the intensity you're doing to that? Because I know people like to talk about, oh, heart rate doesn't matter. You just need to go out, condition, do all these different things. But it's like, there are physiological adaptations that are happening to support your ability to sustain moderate and high intensity movements and repeat them, that you can't get by doing any other training. Like, it's hardwired into our DNA, into our genetic makeup over millions of years of evolution as human beings. But just because we live in a much different society now, where there's a lot of convenience, there's a lot less movement, we don't think the body works that way anymore. But it's like, you're fighting against 5 million years of evolution. I don't like your odds there.
That's sick. That this whole talk kind of got me hyped. So I was more interested in that than I didn't know how a lot of that went. So that's pretty cool. What's kind of the future for you? Well, what's kind of the next step? What are you looking forward to? Like, what's the future of Justin?
Hopefully, if all goes to plan, trying to make a break actually into medical sales. So like I said, I was in an interview process with Stryker for about 10 weeks. Ultimately, and it was the Friday, 4 days after I got fired, Stryker called me to tell me they went with the other finalists, but they told me it was solely on experience. They said I did a phenomenal job, and they actually, like, one, the fact that they called, I think, was a testament to that. And then they had asked if I'd be interested in other positions within the company that, aren't based out of Seattle or the Pacific Northwest, because I was trying to stay up here if I could. But they put me in touch with a recruiter, and they're going to send out my resume and everything to a couple other jobs that I had found throughout the country, that would kind of get me into that, because, I love strength and conditioning. I love being in a weight room. I love everything about it. But it's one of those things where I think figuring out what I wanted out of life, big picture, was something I'd never really put a lot of time and effort into, because when you get caught up in that grind of being a strength coach and you're working, 14, 15, 16-hour days, barely any pay, and just burning the candle at both ends, like, you're so focused in the here and now, it's hard to look that far forward. But now that I had that time to, have a more balanced work-life schedule and figure that stuff out, for me, I realized, like, most important things I need professionally is I can't be stuck in a cubicle. I need to be working face to face with people, and I want to be able to see a, like, direct impact of my work on the health of somebody else. And so, as I was kind of trying to figure out what I want to do, I had a friend of my mom and sister's back in Chicago that she had actually recently transitioned from working with JP Morgan into a job with Stryker, and she loved it. The pay is very good. The benefits are great. There's good work-life balance depending what type of role you go into. But ultimately, I think it's what any job should fundamentally be about, where the more work you put in, the better results you get, the more you should be compensated for your work.
The exact opposite of strength and conditioning.
Yeah, the exact opposite. And so I'm hoping to hear back. Obviously I'm on a crunch of a timeline here with trying to find a new spot, but like I said, I had them send on my resume to 6 or 7 other spots, and then I've been applying to a bunch of other jobs, just any sales job really to get my foot in the door, that has a good track record for developing salesmen, going through training, all that stuff. But I'm more at peace now than ever with the decision to get out, because I know that for me, like the things I care most about, have nothing to do with the weight room. And it was kind of that light bulb moment when the Denver Nuggets won the NBA championships and Jokic was doing his post game presser. And he was like, I don't love basketball. Like, a job's just a job. And I'm like, this is the best fucking player in the entire league. He just carved up everybody, wins the biggest, most accomplished award you can win outside of the Olympics, maybe. And he has the balls to go, I don't like this that much. Like, I just want to go ride my horses back in Serbia. I was like, fuck yes, Nikola Jokic. Like, I don't have any horses, but you know what? I would want to do that too. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm open to relocating now, and hopefully somewhere warmer, because I don't know why. I don't know if this is something like where Scott and I have to do it. He gets all the warm climates. So like Arizona, now he's in Baton Rouge down at LSU. I did Iowa, North Dakota, and now Washington, where it's like, I'm like, I traded in, cold and negative 30-degree temperatures and snow for 7 months of rain and clouds. I was like, I need to go somewhere where like I can walk out in November and it's like 60 degrees outside. But yeah, I mean, for as like shitty of a spot as like I think I'm in from some standpoint, I'm still also the most comfortable I've been with the direction I'm heading, and just the certainty that I'll find a way and like I'll land on my feet. And I do think that's something that strength and conditioning taught me, because you learn to be very resilient and adaptable and intrinsically driven. And so I know that's something where I'll take that with me to other industries, and I think it's a huge advantage to the work ethic you develop if you hold yourself to a certain standard as a professional, that now going into these other industries, I'm bringing something to the table that they might not have seen before. And then all I have to do is learn the technical skills of the job and learn the ins and outs, but then apply the same level of work ethic and thinking that I did to my time as a strength coach, and ultimately it's going to work out. But whether it's medical sales, pharma, corporate tech, whatever it is, I think for me that's the most appealing one, because you get to educate, you get to sell, you get to promote, and ultimately like your destiny's in your hands. And I think after seeing how things have played out with my current job, or previous job, I would much rather have that capacity to control my destiny and control my outcomes.
Yeah, dude, that's fucking awesome. This was sweet. You talk about like what strength conditioning has taught you, but like just and your personal development, like your ability to communicate a message. And not that it was bad before, but like now it's so concise. It's pretty crazy. Like it's pretty cool to like watch. Like you talk about, I've been thinking about this, like the thought process of like weaponizing yourself. Because in the same thing, like I know Jake has mentioned, he was talking to me one time. He was basically like, the thing that makes you a millionaire is just that you're a millionaire. Like you have the tools that made you a millionaire. It's not necessarily your pathway to it. So like it's where you see a lot of rich people, like they lose their fortune and they get rich again. Like they know how to do it. They know the tools. They know like they have developed and weaponized themselves to be a millionaire type person. And that's one of the cool things, like talking to you, like your ability to communicate is so concise and so like crazy from even 2 years ago. Like, I don't know. I geek out about that part. That's awesome.
Well, and that's something where like, it's funny you say that, because I forgot who I was talking. Oh, it was one of the interviewers for Striker. And they had said that, like, because I had to do a mock sales presentation. And that was one of the feedback they gave is like, you're very articulate now and you speak well. And the ironic part is for me is like, I'm someone that weirdly enough, I terrified of public speaking. And like even doing, stuff like podcasts at first, or when I would do talks with groups of soldiers when I got to JBLM, I had like heart pounding, legs shaking, sweating. Like I hated it. And like two things really, I think, helped me develop in that regard. Because I think that's one of the most essential skills you can develop is how to just present yourself, be authentic, communicate, have that stage presence. Because no matter what you go into, like the people who carry themselves that way, some people have it naturally. Anyone who knows me or like grew up with me, they will tell you I was not that kid. Like I did not have that just presence in the room. But to me, like one of the most important things was one, like learning to be authentic. Because Dave Chappelle when he got the Mark Twain Award a couple of years ago, he credited a guy, I think it was Miles Davis, with a line that was, it took me years how to play like myself. And for me as a coach, I think when you come from strength conditioning, like there's all these coaching trees that you can see, like, who came from what coaching tree. And that can be either a very good thing or a very bad thing. And it's in their demeanor, their personality, the way they present themselves, everything. One of the nice things I felt about getting to tactical is you get away from all that bullshit. And through that experience, like I got to start to figure out, like, who the fuck am I? Like, what do I believe in terms of how I talk, how I communicate, and like just how I show who I am to the world. Kier was very influential in that, because obviously I could never be on his level. I don't know if it's because he's British or what, but I think he can get away with a lot more. But just seeing, like, it's not my job to win everyone's approval, but also if I'm trying to sell myself or sell a message, it's going to be a lot easier to get it across if, like, I know who I am and what I'm about. And that takes a lot of, like, just self-reflection and evaluation. And like, I know you've posted about it, and like I posted about it, like, going on a walk on your own, like having time to like think, be outside, and like get away from your phone, get away from everything, and actually like explore those thoughts that typically we're told to like shut out or ignore, or we try to distract ourselves from. Like actually take the time to go through and unpack those. And then the second thing was really just like putting in the work to be confident in my messaging, because I realized a lot of the times as I was, younger in this industry and was trying to speak on things, I maybe had a small understanding, but I had not really put in enough time and effort into like knowing the material inside and out, having the smaller conversations with, staff members, with athletes, with soldiers, whoever it is. And then ultimately like putting myself in situations where, like, through sharing my content and having the opportunity to speak on podcasts, do different webinars and educations, like it was something where, because I started to see that people felt I had a message to share, like I think like most coaches, I probably suffer from imposter syndrome and thinking like I don't know nearly enough, or I'm just a fraud. I've learned to realize like a lot of coaches think that way, and it's probably healthy because it keeps your ego in check. But ultimately, like, these are what my truths are, and at the end of the day, I'm not gonna know if they're right or wrong unless I put them out there and open them up to criticism. And when I stopped worrying about being wrong and stopped worrying about like, is somebody who I'm not even going to think, who I haven't even considered before this moment, like if I put this post out and I get some random guy on Instagram like bashing me for it, I've never fucking thought of this guy in my life. Let's say he hates it. Who the fuck cares? Like it's so, and it's not to be like, oh, you're brash in your messaging, or you're egotistical, but it's very similar. I see like the MMA world operate. Like if you look at Israel Adesanya, because he's one of my favorites, but really any MMA fighter, they talk as much shit as possible going into a fight and are the cockiest people ever. And then certain guys know how to lose better than others. But a guy like Izzy, if he loses, if he gets knocked out, he's humble in defeat. He recognizes it. He goes back and works. But if he were to be on that stage during the pre-fight pressers, and he was like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna, try my hardest, but he's a great fighter too. Like, I don't know, like I'm not gonna fucking root for this guy. Like, people hated McGregor, but look what he had built up through his personality and through his, through the way he operated. And I started to recognize like that's the best way to, become a better version of yourself, is to have that supreme confidence in who you are and what you bring to the table. But then having the humility on the back end of, when you're wrong, when you fail, whatever, go back to the drawing board, work on it, move forward, but not having to worry about like that simple fear of being wrong, because you are either going to be the idiot that holds the industry back or the idiot that pushes the industry forward. And there's only one way to find out which one you are.
Yeah, and at least be one or the other, bro. Like, don't either be fucking Seaman or be like here, like, don't be this fucking middle ground guy. Like, both of them are rich, both of them making a ton of money, but like, fucking do something with your life, bro. Like, that's the thing. It's like, man, and the one of the biggest things that we talked about on the Meathead round table too is like the competency leads to confidence. And I feel like a lot of what we try to do is like, we think about all these ways to be confident, all these ways, like, go get fucking competent. Whether in that's like, we talk about the walks, like that's a big part of being competent in knowing yourself. Like that's a skill set. Who are you? What's your message? You want to get competent at that, go sit with your thoughts, go write your thoughts, go on. Like that's a big piece of it. But it's also just like facts or what you want to talk about, what you want to explain. Like, if you want to be confident, go get really, really fucking smart about something, and I guarantee you can put the because like the insecurity comes from act like you should be insecure. Like that's where
Yep.
that comes from. You should be insecure because you know deep down you don't know enough about what you're saying, and that if somebody smarter than you actually looks a little bit deeper, they can find that out about you. And that's what I realized like a lot on like oh my god, Twitter strength and conditioning. Like it's a whole cesspool of that, bro. It's like, and it's so easy to point out, and I treat it way too much like a game. Like all my stuff is on like Instagram, and like I went to Twitter like as a joke, and now fucking anything on Twitter blows up. So like now Twitter following is growing. So like I still treat it like a game. Like I have the 200 followers, and now more people see it. But I'm like, oh my god, this whole thing is just a cesspool. Like it's such a joke of like it's the worst representation of our field ever. Like every other social media is better. I believe TikTok is better for strength conditioning than Twitter is for strength conditioning. It's so bad. It's like the lack of like just the insecurity. And the thing you said that I want to write a post about, but it triggered a thought. It's like not being able to call a coach out in our field. Like there are good coaches, there are bad coaches. We just are unable to say that. Like we are unable to say that in our field. Like we're unable to call somebody a moron. Like it's like a bad, it's like that's not right. Like that's not a right thought process. You can't just say those things. Like man, that really that got my brain rolling. I don't know really where I was going with that, but yeah, the
Well, here's my
competency
favorite thing on
confidence.
that note, though, because I got into it with somebody, and I'll leave their name out of it out of respect, but the NSCA Tactical National Convention happened in Vegas like 2 months ago or whatever, and the NSCA put out their hype video from it. It was bad. Like again, this is designed for professionals, and like you have people there teaching how to do like a single leg glute bridge. I'm like, this is a professional development opportunity that they're paying like over $1,000 to attend when all is said and done. And and I talked to multiple people that were there, and they all said like presentations were bad and all this thing. And so I like put the clip the NCAA posted on my story, and I put the Michael Scott gif of him like biting his lip and put that on there, and then got reamed by somebody for like, oh, you don't know the context. Like all like it's a short clip, you don't know the full context. You can't just bash on people, you can't just shit on people. Again, you take the argument, use it against them. Okay, so I'm not allowed to share anything in support of good content because I also don't have the full context there. So even if a practitioner shares something that for those 30 seconds looks good, they could be fucking it up the other 60 minutes of their session. So we're not allowed to promote anything. And if you're saying we can only share something if we have something positive to say, then it's pure virtue signaling. And I was like, criticism and support or people hating on something is what drive, like whether we like it or not, that is what drives growth and change. And like I remember I put up a post one time, and my old intern supervisor when I was at Iowa, he had commented on it, and he had put up a different opinion and like argued against my thinking. And we had a back and forth exchange, and this was a couple years ago. We had a back and forth exchange in the comment section, and my ideas, his ideas. But at the end of the day, like even though like we spoke very directly, but I never took it as like he was attacking me. It was I put this idea out there, he sees it differently, and we need to be able to have a conversation. And he has every right to tell me that I'm looking at this wrong. I don't understand what I'm talking about. And if one person telling me that completely shatters my world or my sense of self-worth, I probably wasn't a very good coach to begin with. But we need to be able to, and there's obviously a right and a wrong way, but again, it comes back to like within all the nuance of our industry and the things that there's a lot of gray area in, we need to be able to call out what is objectively bad. And I feel like as an industry, it's symptomatic of the lack of standardization, the lack of a clear path to becoming a coach, and and quantifying our own job, and getting away from the good old boys club of squat, bench, dead, Olympic lifting, who's got the biggest bench, do you fill the sleeves, squat to over bullshit. Like get away from all that, and let's start getting to quantifying performance to the best extent we can, and showing that our training is improving those outcomes, and that there's both objective and subjective parameters that go into that. But instead, we still have people arguing about whether or not they should be catching Olympic lifts, doing Olympic lifts, front squatting. Like we're splitting hairs over these things that just don't fucking matter. And then we're failing to see the bigger picture of what direction is the industry pushing in. And it's one of those things I think a lot of people have tried to solve and tried to set the right example for. But I just think with how saturated the industry is, and also just the bro mentality that is inherent to a, very masculine industry, I think that kind of trumps the rational approach that often needs to be utilized. And instead it just goes, you see coaches who, unless you, squat 500 pounds or whatever, they don't think your opinion's worth a damn. But meanwhile, like they're pre-diabetic, their resting heart rate's in the 80s, and like they look like they're on the verge of a heart attack. And I'm like, how are you going to talk to me about health? And you can't walk up a flight of stairs without getting out of breath. And it's like, so we need to be able to have, those conversations where, like, again, even as I called out people in the industry about not being in shape and having poor conditioning, my DMs were hot with middle-aged men extremely pissed off by some memes. And I'm sure you're no stranger to that. And I was like, first of all, they're fucking memes. Calm down. Second of all, like, if you can refute the point I'm making about being unhealthy, go for it. But if you can't, and you're either too proud or unwilling to admit that, hey, this is something I've overlooked, I need to change and grow, then there's no dialogue to happen there. But if I can't point that out to you without you at least having some type of self-reflection about it, then there's not much of a dialogue to be had, and the industry goes nowhere, because then we just have the meathead strength guys in one camp. We have the, constraints led guy in another camp. We have, all these different guys, versus recognizing that, hey, like, this is one industry. We all need to understand each other better to some extent, but we need to get away with, like, losing, the forest for the trees and having these petty arguments, and instead figure out the bigger picture of what we're pushing towards.
Well, I think that's the biggest thing that you mentioned too. It's like, if I put out an idea you don't think it's right, and you can't refute my points, like, then what are we talking about? Like, that's the biggest thing I've got into arguments with coaches about. Like, and the other thing is, like, it speeds up your ability to grow as a coach too, is arguing with other coaches. Like, it does. Like, that number
Hell
one
yeah.
thing. And people get so
Absolutely.
mad. It's like, why are you arguing? Why are you arguing? It's like, bro, it's what humans do. Like, I don't hate the person. I don't, like, even if I'm trolling or memeing, I don't hate anybody in our field. It's such a silly field. Like, even if I'm making fun of them, it's just because it's funny. Like, I think it's funny. Like, but it's like, how much better you get at explaining and defending your points by battle. Like, that's what I look at it. It's like, I enjoy, like, okay, let's go to battle. Let's see if this idea works. Let's see if I'm able to get, and how much better I have gotten at it. And there is a dangerous part there too. I know Peterson talks about this too. It's like, when you have sharpened your tongue to a point in which you are able to battle bullshit because you're just so good at battling. Like, that is a part I think about too. But it's like, I don't think any of us coaches are there at that level. Most coaches are not even close. And you get to a point in which they could be saying something right, but they just have they either don't know how to articulate their thoughts, and they aren't able to, like, explain it, and they get emotional. Like, that's the other thing. Like, they know they can't articulate it, or they know they're wrong, and then they get emotional. And when they get emotional, it's kind of like, okay, this battle's over. Like, you've already exploded. Like, it's done. But it's like, there's so much art in what can be done there. And you don't have to hate. We're like, again, like, I don't know. I just look at it such from an outside perspective. Like, we're teaching PE, we're making memes. Like, I'm not gonna hate you for that. Like, we're not going to war. Like, I'm not shooting at you. You're not shooting at me. Most of us are from the same fucking country. Like, what are we talking about? Like, I don't hate you. I'm making a meme. I think it's funny. Like, what are we talking about here? But we should still talk about these things and go to battle and work on our thought processes through Twitter. Like, the whole thing is like, I heard the quote, maybe it was Roe, somebody was talking about, basically, like, let your ideas die so you don't have to. Like, the Chris guy on Twitter right now, he just let himself die because he refused to let his ideas die against Kier, and Kier picked him apart for fucking 2 days straight. It's like, let your ideas die, man. Like, if you can't refute it, if you can't come up with a logical argument back, that probably should tell you something about your ideas. Either you're not good enough at articulating them, or your ideas suck. Most likely number two, possibly number one, probably a combination of both.
Yeah, and I think just as a field, we are currently our own biggest obstacle to growth, in the standpoint of, and I shared the clip of from Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where they're trying to talk about if God is real or not. And Mac does a whole thing on how science is a liar sometimes. And he points to, like, I think he starts with, like, Aristotle. And he's like, Aristotle was thought to be the smartest man in the world, like, believed all these things, helped this, I can't remember what the discovery he said it was. And he's like, he also believed the earth was the center of the universe. And then, years later, Galileo came along and he proved that wrong. But he thought this major thing, and because he was the smartest guy in the world, everyone thought that was true. And then years later, Sir Isaac Newton came along, and it was like, no matter what you believe now, like you're going to be wrong in some extent. But if we're not allowed to challenge like the forefathers and the founders and the OGs and their ideas, like if going against them is considered, negligent or just wrong, then the industry goes nowhere. Because strength conditioning has been around since, in some capacity since like 1950s, 1960s. Do we really think in 60 years we've figured it all out? And the way that Boyd Epley and Al Vermeil and all those guys were pioneers in our industry, and they did great things for their time. But if you looked at what some of the programming that was done back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that was having these profound impacts, it would be dog shit by today's standard. And that's not a like knock on them. They had so much less information. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have all these conferences and these podcasts and everything to take information from. So we can take bits and pieces from them. But I put up something from the training that the Alvin Roy had LSU doing back in the 60s when they went on to have an undefeated season 1 year later. They're doing 2x15 Olympic lifts and bodybuilding movements. And I was like, okay, if we're going to die on this hill, if any of you got full-time strength coaches have an intern that pitched that as a programming plan and you approved of it, I'll shut the fuck up. But we all know you would think that that's a dumb program. And it doesn't mean that Alvin Roy was a bad coach. It just means we knew far less at the time. But there's so many times like guys, the whole stick to the fundamentals, stick to the basics, yada, yada, yada. It's like our understanding of what the fundamentals are should change over time. And they should grow and they should evolve and adapt. But if every time we prop up someone's argument and we say, you're not allowed to have that opinion because either you don't have enough experience or it's not what, insert Hall of Fame, gold jacket, master strength conditioning coach said here, like if it's those two things, we don't go anywhere as an industry. Like your experience only matters to a certain extent, but that doesn't mean that, someone like you or I, because I remember when, you were starting to share your ideas and it was like, oh, well, you're some 24, 25-year-old guy. Like you don't have enough skin in the game. Like, what do you know? It's like him being 25 does not change that he's making very good points. And also that his ideas are worth exploring. And then now, you see where you're at a couple years later, and suddenly, you've amassed the following you have coaches looking at the small-sided games, the, incorporating more play elements, getting away from all the structure. And it's like, it's the same shit you were preaching years ago, but were laughed at simply because it was new and it diverged from the conventional thought in our industry. And I think that's where we need more people that are okay sharing their opinion and voicing their beliefs. Because again, like you said, like that discourse, that going to verbal battle is what sharpens your own sword, and it helps you figure out whether or not your ideas have merit. But when we're more concerned about feelings and all that, and not being disrespectful or not speaking against somebody, I think we're doing a disservice to ourselves in the name of, again, virtue signaling.
Well, even worse too. It's like what I've noticed is like it went from the point of like I still sometimes get that side of it from coaches that are higher up, like you're just some 20-something-year-old coach. But the other one that scares me even more is the guys that will like, I'll post something and they're like, absolutely agree with everything you say, like, and like I'm their Boyle. Like that is so bad, dude. Like I don't agree with everything I fucking say. Like, don't do that. Like that is the biggest thing of like, there are no experts. It's like, now you're just replacing that person with fucking me. Like, I'm an idiot. Do not do that. I'm just like saying thoughts and like working on, like, I don't agree with everything I say. I change my thought process all the time. You cannot possibly agree with everything I say, and that's the biggest, like scariest thing is like, I'm at even a small level, people are already doing that. And then like, that's how I see it's like, oh, that's how it starts. And then you get that feeling, then people just like double down on that. And then it's just a fucking time game. Like if I just keep doing what I'm doing, it just, the followers just grow. Like it's literally nothing but time at that point, like I don't have to change anything. I don't have to change any of my thoughts. If I just keep posting, I don't change any thoughts. I don't do anything. It's just time. It's just like, that's how you amass followers. So now you're just going to agree with everything I say, and I'm just going to get more followers. I haven't changed my thought processes in 20 years, but I just know this system works. It keeps going. So like, that's the thing that really sketches me out is like seeing it happen live, of like going from it being rejected to now going to being some coaches like Mike Boyles, where nothing I say is wrong, and they'll defend me to the death. There's like, that's just so wrong. That is so wrong. I am a 27-year-old idiot. That's the whole point. And he's a 47-year-old idiot. Like, we're all idiots. That's the whole point of it. Let's be idiots together, not worship other idiots.
You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
God damn. But yeah, this was good. We just ripped 2 hours. This was sweet. This is one of our longer podcasts that we've done. This is hopefully I think we covered everything we wanted to cover, and it was pretty smooth. This is one of our podcasts. I was telling you, we didn't even work up any questions. I just sent you a little voice message and said, let's rip.
Yeah, I mean, you let me be free, and got plenty of time on my hands. But no, I mean, I enjoy doing stuff like this. I think having bigger conversations about the industry. I think as much as it'll probably, I get when you leave it, when you leave strength conditioning, it's kind of like a cult where I'm sure I'll be told like I couldn't hack it or I didn't want it bad enough or whatever. And like now I'm the bitter guy like bagging on the field. It's like these are the same things I was saying while I was in the field that other people have said. And it's again like these conversations should be happening. And if that many people are leaving, I think we've seen more and more coaches get out of the profession. At some point, the people in the profession need to look at themselves and be like, all right, my 20 years of experience don't mean shit. We're missing the mark somewhere. And so I'm hopeful, if nothing else, like the conversations continue to happen because, it burned out my joy in the field. Like, again, I love training. I love working out. I love all those things. But my passion for like this industry has completely fizzled out because of just the dynamics of the job, the way things have played out. And, to pour so much into something that you have to spend 90% of your time trying to convince other people who don't have that background that, oh, hey, I know what I'm talking about. It's beyond frustrating. So I think, for those that have the skin in the game and have been around, like continuing to push the needle forward and, try to fix things for those that come after them instead of trying to make it harder and more difficult for those trying to get in, like find ways to make it easier and to make our job a more normal part of whether it's collegiate environment, the tactical environment, private sector. Like each professional has a responsibility to drive the field that way. And if not, then I think you're holding us back long term.
Hell yeah. That was sweet. Thanks for being on, dude.
But yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been good to catch up and chat with you. I'm sure we'll cross paths again sometime in the future.
Absolutely. Every 2 years we'll do it. Thank you guys for listening. Keep chopping wood. Boom.
Thank you for listening. Join us next week as we dive down another rabbit hole. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star rating. Follow us on Instagram at Austin Yoakum to stay updated on future podcast guests. Keep chopping wood.